August 12, 1944, 0547 hours. Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann pressed his field glasses against his eyes and watched something that defied every principle of artillery warfare he had learned at the Dresden Academy. Across the wheat fields of Mortain, France, the horizon erupted, not in the familiar rolling sequence of incoming fire, but in a single, unified holocaust. Hundreds of explosions blossomed simultaneously across a 3-kilometer front as if God himself had pressed a button to ignite the earth. Das ist unmöglich, he whispered. Impossible. The ground beneath Hartmann's observation post shuddered. He had survived Stalingrad, had weathered Soviet Katyusha barrages that turned the sky into sheets of flame. But this was different. The Americans weren't just firing artillery. They were conducting an orchestra of destruction with inhuman precision, and the Germans had no answer for it. The story of how the United States achieved this seemingly magical capability began not on the battlefields of France, but in the quiet offices of Fort Sill, Oklahoma, nearly a decade earlier. It was a revolution born from mathematics, radio waves, and a fundamental reimagining of what artillery could be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In 1935, artillery warfare followed patterns established in the trenches of the Great War. When a battery commander received orders to fire, each gun crew worked independently. They calculated trajectories, adjusted elevation, loaded shells, and fired when ready. The result was a staggered bombardment, shells arriving over seconds or even minutes, giving defenders time to seek cover between impacts. Hauptmann Werner Schultz, who would later command the 352nd Artillery Regiment in Normandy, studied these methods at the Berlin War Academy. The German doctrine emphasized accuracy over speed, precision over volume. Each gun was a craftsman's tool, operated by men trained to place individual shells with surgical exactness. "We believed," Schultz wrote in his journal in 1938, "that artillery mastery lay in the gunner's skill, his ability to read wind, calculate range, and adjust fire through observation. A good battery could place 10 shells within a 20-meter circle at 5 kilometers. This was the pinnacle of the art." The German army invested heavily in this philosophy. Officers spent years mastering ballistic tables, learning to account for temperature, barrel wear, even the rotation of the earth. The Lefh-18 howitzer, backbone of German artillery, could deliver devastating fire, but always in sequence, always with that telltale rhythm that gave infantry precious seconds to react. In the forests of East Prussia, at the Kummersdorf Proving Grounds, German engineers tested their weapons against the clock. The fastest crews could sustain 3 rounds per minute, an impressive rate. Battery commanders coordinated fire through field telephones, shouting corrections to gun captains who relayed orders to their crews. It was sophisticated, it was proven, and it was about to become obsolete. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Colonel Harrison Reed stood in a sweltering tent at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in the summer of 1941, staring at a problem that had vexed artillerymen since gunpowder was invented. On the table before him lay reports from observers in Spain, where the Civil War had revealed the limitations of conventional artillery coordination. "Gentlemen," Reed addressed the assembled officers of the artillery board, "we fire by battery, regiment if we're lucky. The enemy hears the first shells and takes cover before the rest arrive. We're telegraphing our punches. Major Thomas Blackwood, Reed's chief of staff, had brought a radical proposal from a young lieutenant named James Corrigan. The concept was simple in theory, revolutionary in practice. Calculate firing data so that shells from dozens, even hundreds of guns would arrive at the target at exactly the same instant, regardless of their distance from the target. The technique would be called time on target, or TOT, but making it work required solving problems that seemed insurmountable. Lieutenant Corrigan, a mathematics graduate from MIT, had spent 18 months developing the calculations. The challenge wasn't just ballistics, it was synchronization across distances, terrain, and the chaos of combat. Each gun has a different flight time, Corrigan explained, his fingers dancing across a chalkboard covered in equations. A howitzer 15 kilometers away might need 45 seconds for the shell to reach the target. A gun at 10 kilometers needs only 30 seconds. If they both fire when ordered, the shells arrive 15 seconds apart. The solution was elegant, but demanded precision that had never been attempted. Calculate the exact flight time for each gun, then subtract that time from a predetermined H-hour. Every battery would fire at a different moment, but the shells would converge on the target simultaneously. By mid-1941, when America entered the war, Corrigan's theories were being tested at Fort Sill under the direction of Brigadier General Samuel Morrison. The results were promising, but inconsistent. The missing piece wasn't mathematics, it was communication. In a laboratory at Camp Roberts, California, engineers from the Signal Corps were developing technology that would transform battlefield coordination. The SCR-619 radio set, combined with improved frequency management, allowed artillery officers to communicate across entire divisions without laying a single wire. Captain Robert Thornton, commanding the 7th Field Artillery Battalion's Fire Direction Center, described the breakthrough in a letter to his wife. Imagine conducting an entire symphony orchestra where the musicians are scattered across 5 miles of countryside and you're directing them by radio. That's what we're building. The Fire Direction Center, FDC, became the brain of American artillery. Instead of individual battery commanders making decisions, a centralized team of officers and enlisted specialists received target coordinates, calculated firing data for every gun in range, and transmitted orders simultaneously by radio. Staff Sergeant William Hayes, who operated an FDC during the North Africa campaign, kept detailed notes of the process. We had plotting boards 8 feet wide, meteorological data updated hourly, and calculating machines that could process trajectory data in minutes instead of hours. When the FDC sent the fire order, every battery, whether 2 miles away or 10, received identical instructions adjusted for their position. The system required new training and new thinking. Gun crews no longer calculated their own data. They followed instructions from the FDC. Forward observers radioed coordinates to the FDC, not to individual batteries. The entire artillery arm of a division became one unified weapon system. By mid-1943, American artillery battalions in Sicily were routinely executing TOT missions with 12 to 18 guns. The effect on German and Italian defenders was devastating and deeply unsettling.
General Major Paul Richter commanded the 16th Panzer Division Artillery at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, February 1943. His after-action report, filed with Army Group Africa, described an experience that left him shaken. At 14:20 hours, our forward positions came under concentrated fire. This was not the typical American bombardment, scattered, poorly coordinated, easy to weather. Instead, approximately 40 shells detonated within a 5-second window across a 400-meter front. The effect was catastrophic. We lost 3 prime movers, 2 ammunition trucks, and 17 men before anyone could react. Richter's report reached Berlin in March. At OKW headquarters, staff officers struggled to explain the phenomenon. Some theorized that the Americans had developed new proximity fuses that somehow synchronized detonation. Others suggested experimental weapons, perhaps rocket artillery, similar to the Soviet Katyusha. The truth, that American artillery had achieved perfect synchronization through mathematics and radio, seemed too simple to be credible. German doctrine had always emphasized individual gun excellence. The idea that centralized coordination could surpass distributed skill contradicted decades of military theory. Oberst Heinrich Müller, the Wehrmacht's chief artillery inspector, reviewed reports from Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy throughout 1943. Each described the same phenomenon: sudden, overwhelming barrages that gave no warning and no opportunity for evasion. But Muller's recommendations for investigation were sidelined by more pressing concerns: the Eastern Front's endless appetite for men and shells, the need to fortify France against invasion, the collapsing situation in Italy. "We acknowledge the American capability," Muller wrote in his personal memoir after the war, "but we failed to grasp its implications. We thought it was a trick, a tactical innovation that clever commanders could counter. We didn't understand that it represented a fundamental transformation of artillery warfare." German doctrine attempted minor adaptations. Artillery officers were instructed to disperse their batteries more widely, to minimize casualties from concentrated fire. Forward observers received better radio equipment. But these were tactical adjustments to a strategic revolution. The real problem was structural. German artillery remained committed to decentralized command, with battery captains maintaining significant autonomy. The fire direction systems were rudimentary, relying on telephone networks that Allied air power and artillery systematically destroyed. Without the infrastructure for centralized coordination, the Wehrmacht couldn't replicate American methods even if they had wanted to. Throughout 1943, American artillery battalions refined taught procedures in combat. In Sicily, the 32nd Field Artillery Brigade, under Colonel David Preston, executed the largest taught mission to date, 72 guns firing on a German counterattack near Gela. Lieutenant Raymond Foster, a forward observer with the 1st Infantry Division, witnessed the barrage from a church tower. "I called in the coordinates at 06:15. The FDC rogered and said taught in 8 minutes. I watched the German column through my binoculars, tanks, half-tracks, trucks moving up the road in the early morning light. At 06:23 exactly, the world ended for them." Foster's report noted that the first German vehicles were still advancing when the barrage hit. They had no idea it was coming. There was no ranging shot, no warning. One moment the column was intact, the next it was a smoking ruin. The shells hit simultaneously across a half-kilometer of road. It was like watching film where someone cut out several frames. The column just ceased to exist between one breath and the next. The psychological impact equaled the physical destruction. German troops who survived taught barrages reported a unique terror: the absence of warning, the impossibility of taking cover, the sense that American artillery could reach out and obliterate any position with godlike instantaneity. At Fort Sill, trainers incorporated lessons from combat. The standard became 16 guns minimum for a taught mission, though the system could coordinate hundreds. Timing windows tightened from 10 seconds to 5 to 3. By D-Day, American artillery crews could execute complex taught missions almost reflexively. The industrial capacity behind this capability was equally impressive. Motorola and Galvin Manufacturing produced thousands of SCR-619 radios. Artillery battalions received specially designed calculating devices, mechanical computers that could process firing data in minutes. The M2 plotting board, manufactured by the thousands at plants in Detroit and Chicago, standardized fire direction procedures across the entire Army. Training cycles expanded to include weeks of FDC operations. Lieutenants fresh from officer candidate school spent as much time learning radio procedures and fire direction protocols as they did studying ballistics. The U.S. Army was building an artillery force that fought not as individual guns, but as a single, interconnected system.
By August 1944, the American breakout from Normandy had shattered German positions across France. Hitler, desperate to reverse Allied momentum, ordered a counteroffensive aimed at Avronez, hoping to cut off Patton's Third Army and restore the front. Operation Luttich assembled the last mobile German reserves in France. The 2nd and 116th Panzer Divisions supported by elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division. The plan called for a night assault through Mortain to reach the coast, splitting the American armies. Oberleutnant Klaus Becker commanded a Kampfgruppe of the 116th Panzer Division. His unit included 35 Panther tanks, 20 half-tracks, and supporting infantry. At midnight on August 7th, Becker's column moved forward under clear skies, hoping to exploit the darkness before American air power could intervene at dawn. By 0230 hours, Becker's spearhead had advanced 4 kilometers. Resistance was light, scattered American infantry outposts quickly overrun. The Panther's powerful 75mm guns made short work of defensive positions. For a few hours, it seemed the offensive might succeed. But the Americans had something the Germans didn't expect: proximity and preparation. The U.S. 7th Corps Artillery included 12 battalions of 105mm howitzers and 6 battalions of 155mm guns. 234 tubes in total, all coordinated through a Corps-level fire direction center at Mortain. Brigadier General Charles Thompson commanded this artillery arm with a mandate to stop any German breakthrough by any means necessary. At 0330 hours, a forward observer from the 30th Infantry Division, Captain Louis Morgan, radioed coordinates for the lead German elements. Within minutes, the Corps FDC had calculated firing data for every battery in range and transmitted the order: TOT on designated coordinates, H-hour 0347. Oberleutnant Becker was standing in the hatch of his command Panther, scanning the road ahead through night vision binoculars when the world disintegrated. At precisely 0347, 134 shells, 105mm and 155mm mixed, detonated across a 600-meter stretch of road. The barrage lasted exactly 12 seconds, and when it ended, Becker's Kampfgruppe had ceased to exist as a combat formation. Becker survived because his Panther, at the rear of the column, was outside the impact zone. He said, "I saw the flashes, hundreds of them, all at once, like a photographer's flashbulb the size of a battlefield. The noise came after, a sound so enormous it felt physical, like being struck. When my vision cleared, I saw fires, wrecked vehicles, men running in confusion. We had lost 20 tanks and most of our infantry in 12 seconds. The Germans attempted to regroup, but American artillery had only begun. Throughout the morning of August 7th, TOT missions fell on every German concentration that forward observers could identify. Units that dispersed to avoid fire found themselves targeted by individual batteries. Units that massed for assault were obliterated by Corps-level TOT strikes. Generalleutnant Heinrich von Lüttwitz, commanding the 2nd Panzer Division, sent a desperate message to 7th Army headquarters at 0820 hours. Impossible to advance under this fire. Americans can mass an entire division artillery on a single grid square with no warning. Request permission to withdraw. Permission was denied. Hitler's orders were explicit: take Avronez or die trying. For 3 days, German armored units hurled themselves against American positions, and for 3 days, American artillery ground them to pieces. Feldwebel Dieter Koch, a veteran panzer commander, kept a diary that survived the war. His entry for August 8th reads, "We cannot fight this. When we move, the shells arrive before we can take cover. When we stop, the shells find us anyway.
The Americans have turned artillery into something new, something we have no defense against. It is like fighting ghosts who can strike from the horizon. By August 12th, when Oberleutnant Hartmann witnessed the barrage that opened this story, the Mortain counteroffensive had collapsed completely. The Germans lost 100 tanks, 50 assault guns, and approximately 2,400 men killed or wounded. American casualties were a fraction of that, primarily infantry in the initial German assault.
Behind the tactical revolution of TOT lay industrial might that Germany could not match. By mid-1944, American factories were producing artillery shells at a rate that defied belief. The Joliet Arsenal in Illinois, operating 3 shifts, produced 45,000 105mm shells per day. The Lake City Ammunition Plant in Missouri matched that output. Similar facilities in Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Iowa together produced over 3 million artillery shells monthly. German production, by comparison, had peaked at 1.2 million shells monthly in early 1944, before Allied bombing and resource shortages caused precipitous decline. By August, German factories were producing fewer than 600,000 shells per month, and those had to serve both Eastern and Western fronts. The disparity showed on the battlefield. American artillery battalions fired without concerning themselves with conservation. If a target required 500 rounds to neutralize, they fired 500 rounds. German batteries, by contrast, operated under strict ammunition discipline, rationing shells and prioritizing only the most critical targets. Major Robert Hammond, operations officer for the 8th Field Artillery Battalion, noted in his diary, "We fire more shells in a single TOT mission than some German batteries receive in a week. Our crews don't think about conservation, they think about effect on target. That psychological freedom, knowing the shells will always be there, changes how artillery fights." The logistics were equally impressive. The Red Ball Express and other supply routes moved ammunition from ports to frontline units with industrial efficiency. Each American division received daily resupply convoys, trucks loaded with shells, powdered charges, and fuses. Forward ammunition dumps held thousands of rounds, replenished as fast as they were expended. German supply lines, by contrast, were under constant attack from Allied air power. Trains carrying ammunition were bombed, trucks were strafed, depots were destroyed. German artillery units often operated at 30 to 40% of authorized shell allocation, forcing commanders to choose between targets rather than engaging everything in range. The psychological dimension. The terror of TOT fire went beyond its physical destruction. German soldiers, accustomed to artillery's traditional rhythm, found themselves psychologically unprepared for instant, overwhelming bombardment. Gefreiter Anton Weber, a machine gunner in the 352nd Infantry Division, wrote to his family in September 1944, "It is the uncertainty that breaks us. With Soviet artillery, you hear the first shells and no more are coming. You can take cover, move, react. With the Americans, there is no warning. You are standing in your position one moment, and the next, 50 shells detonate simultaneously. There is no time to think, to move, to pray. You simply cease to exist, or you survive by pure chance." German medical officers reported significant increases in combat fatigue and what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. Men who had endured years on the Eastern Front broke under days of American artillery fire. The randomness, surviving one barrage only to be obliterated by the next, with no warning and no pattern, eroded the psychological resilience that sustained soldiers through conventional bombardment. Oberst Müller, in his post-war memoir, reflected on this aspect. "We trained our men to be brave under fire, to endure bombardment and press forward. But TOT fire didn't allow for bravery. It didn't give men the chance to demonstrate courage or discipline. It simply killed them before they knew they were under attack. That violated something fundamental in how soldiers understood combat. The effect on German tactics was profound. Units began refusing to mass for attacks, knowing that concentration meant annihilation.
Commanders dispersed their forces to minimize TOT effectiveness, but dispersion reduced combat power and made coordinated operations nearly impossible. The Americans had created a tactical dilemma with no good solution.
The smoking ruins of Mortain told only part of the story. While German commanders struggled to comprehend what had destroyed their offensive, in Washington, D.C., and at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, analysts were drawing far-reaching conclusions about the future of warfare. Colonel Alexander Winters, Chief Artillery Advisor to General Omar Bradley, compiled a comprehensive report in late August 1944. His assessment was blunt. The Wehrmacht's artillery doctrine is obsolete. Their commitment to decentralized battery command and telephone-based coordination makes them incapable of executing massed, synchronized fire. This is not a training deficiency, it is a structural impossibility given their current organization. Winters' report circulated through the upper echelons of Allied command. It revealed something that went beyond tactical advantage. The Americans had achieved what military theorists call a capability overmatch, a situation where one side possesses abilities the enemy cannot replicate even if they understand them. The German army's leadership was painfully aware of this reality. General Oberst Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding Army Group G in southern France, submitted a lengthy analysis to OKW in September 1944. His conclusion was devastating. The enemy's artillery coordination represents a systemic advantage we cannot counter with our current force structure. Recommendations: immediate reorganization of artillery command, centralized fire direction at division level minimum, priority allocation of radio equipment, estimated implementation time 6 to 8 months, estimated cost 40,000 trained personnel and industrial capacity we do not possess. The report reached Hitler's desk and was promptly ignored. By September 1944, Germany faced existential threats on all fronts. The resources and time required to reorganize artillery doctrine simply didn't exist. The Wehrmacht would fight the rest of the war with artillery methods that had become obsolete. Unteroffizier Rudolf Steiner commanded a mortar section in the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division. His unit took up positions near the Belgian border in September 1944, tasked with slowing the American advance toward Germany. Steiner's diary, discovered after the war, provides a soldier's eye view of fighting against American artillery. His entry for September 18th reads, "We dug in yesterday evening, good positions, excellent fields of fire. At 0730, American forward observers must have spotted us. At 0745, the world ended. I counted, 3 seconds from the first explosion to the last. My section was spread across 150 meters. Every position hit simultaneously. 9 men dead, 4 wounded. I survived because I was in the latrine trench, 50 meters away. Pure luck." The next day, we moved positions after dark, stayed dispersed, maintained radio silence, thought we were safe. At 12:25, it happened again. 20 shells, maybe more, all at once. They knew exactly where we were. How? We see no planes, hear no observers, yet they find us and destroy us with surgical precision. By September 22nd, Steiner's handwriting had deteriorated. "Cannot sleep. Every sound makes me flinch. We are down to half strength and have fired perhaps 50 rounds. They have fired thousands at us. There is no answer to this. We hide, they kill us. We move, they find us. We cannot fight what we cannot see or reach." German medical reports from this period document what doctors called artillery neurosis on a scale unseen even on the Eastern Front. Men who had endured years of Soviet bombardment broke down after days of American TOT fire. The key difference, medical officers noted, was predictability. Soviet artillery followed patterns, preparatory barrages, ranging shots, sequential fire that soldiers could anticipate and mentally prepare for. American TOT fire offered no such psychological preparation. It simply happened, instantly and devastatingly. Oberarzt Franz Richter, senior medical officer for the 89th Infantry Division, wrote in his September report, "We are seeing complete psychological collapse in men with otherwise exemplary combat records.
The instantaneous nature of American artillery fire creates a learned helplessness. Soldiers realize that no action on their part, no vigilance or skill, can prevent sudden death. This destroys the psychological frameworks that allow men to function under fire. The industrial abyss. While German soldiers struggled with the tactical reality, their high command grappled with industrial facts that made the situation hopeless. In October 1944, Reichsmaster Albert Speer submitted a confidential report to Hitler on artillery production capacity. The numbers were catastrophic. American shell production had reached 4.2 million rounds monthly, 105mm, 155mm, and larger calibers combined. German production had fallen to 410,000 rounds monthly, a tenfold disparity that was widening. More critically, the Americans were producing the specialized equipment that made TOT possible. By autumn 1944, U.S. factories had delivered 12,400 SCR-619 radio sets to artillery units, along with 8,700 improved plotting boards and thousands of specialized calculating devices. Germany had nothing comparable in production. Major Heinrich Vogel, assigned to evaluate captured American artillery equipment, submitted a technical assessment that reached Speer's office in November 1944. The American fire direction system relies on standardized equipment produced in quantities we cannot match. Their plotting boards alone require precision manufacturing we cannot sustain under current bombing. Their radios use components from civilian electronics plants, resources we long ago diverted to military production. To replicate their capability, we would need to rebuild our industrial base from foundation upward. The Krupp Works at Essen, Germany's premier artillery manufacturer, attempted to develop a centralized fire direction system in late 1944. Engineers worked from captured American equipment and interrogations of prisoners. By December, they had a prototype system that could theoretically coordinate fire from 8 batteries. It was too little, impossibly late. The prototype required copper wiring that wasn't available, radio tubes that weren't in production, and trained operators that didn't exist. The project was canceled in January 1945 when the Ruhr came under direct assault. Even if Germany possessed the equipment, the organizational transformation required to use it effectively was beyond reach. The German artillery arm was built around battery autonomy and officer initiative, values deeply embedded in military culture. American artillery centralized decision-making, required strict adherence to FDC orders, and subordinated individual initiative to system coordination. Changing that culture would have required years of institutional reform, time Germany didn't have.
Unable to match American capabilities, German commanders attempted tactical adaptations that might mitigate their disadvantage. Oberst Karl Hoffmann, commanding artillery for the 6th SS Mountain Division in Alsace, implemented a novel approach in November 1944. Rather than concentrating his batteries for maximum firepower, he dispersed them widely, single guns positioned kilometers apart, each with autonomous fire missions. The theory was simple. American TOT relied on massing fires against concentrated positions. Dispersed guns couldn't be destroyed en masse. The tactic failed spectacularly. Isolated German guns could deliver harassing fire, but lacked the concentration to suppress American positions. Meanwhile, American counter-battery radar, another technology the Germans lacked, located each gun from its first shot. Individual batteries found themselves targeted by multiple American battalions, obliterated before they could displace. Hoffmann's after-action report was bitter. Dispersion prevents our destruction in a single blow, but it also prevents effective fire support. We have become irrelevant on our own battlefield. American infantry advances under the cover of massed artillery we cannot suppress. Our dispersed guns fire ineffectually and are hunted down one by one. This is not warfare, it is extermination. Another attempted solution was movement. German doctrine had always emphasized mobility, shoot and move, avoiding counter-battery fire through rapid displacement.
But American counter-battery response times made this suicidal. By late 1944, American artillery could identify a firing position and deliver TOT fire within 3 minutes. German gun crews needed 5 to 7 minutes to limber, move, and reposition. Hauptmann Wolfgang Kruger, battery commander in the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, experienced this firsthand in December 1944 during the Ardennes offensive. We fired a 6-round mission at 08:20. At 08:22, we began limbering the guns for displacement. At 08:23, the American barrage arrived, 40 shells simultaneously impacting our former position. Had we been slower, the entire battery would have been lost. We relocated and prepared to fire again. At 09:15, we fired 3 rounds. At 09:17, another barrage, 60 shells this time, hitting our new position before we could begin moving. We lost 2 guns and their crews. I ordered the remaining guns to cease fire and retreat. There was no point continuing. November 1944 brought some of the war's most brutal fighting to the Hurtgen Forest, a densely wooded area along the German-Belgian border. The terrain seemed to offer German defenders an advantage. Thick forest canopy limited aerial observation, and the close-quarters combat negated American artillery's range advantage. The reality proved otherwise. American artillery adapted with characteristic efficiency. Colonel Lawrence Webster, commanding the 18th Field Artillery Brigade, supporting the 4th Infantry Division, pioneered techniques for forest fighting. Unable to observe targets directly, American forward observers called in TOT fires on map coordinates, crossroads, forest clearings, suspected German positions identified through intelligence and patrols. The effect was psychologically devastating. German defenders in the Hurtgen had no warning, no opportunity to observe incoming fire and take cover. Shells simply arrived, detonating in the forest canopy and showering deadly fragments downward. Tree bursts, shells exploding in branches above ground, were particularly lethal, creating casualties impossible to avoid by foxhole or trench. Lieutenant Otto Becker, platoon commander in the 275th Infantry Division, wrote of the experience, "You cannot see the enemy, cannot see the shells coming, cannot predict when death will arrive. Men sit in bunkers believing themselves safe, and artillery penetrates the forest ceiling to kill them. Others run between positions and are caught in barrages they never heard approaching. The forest we thought would protect us has become a trap." American artillery fired over 500,000 shells into the Hurtgen Forest between November and December 1944, an average of 8,300 rounds daily for 2 months. The forest itself became a casualty. Mature trees shattered by high explosive, the terrain transformed into a lunar landscape of craters and splintered timber. German casualties in the Hurtgen included approximately 28,000 killed and wounded. American losses were also severe, 24,000 casualties, but the artillery disparity meant that German units were systematically destroyed, while American infantry, despite heavy losses, maintained combat effectiveness through continuous reinforcement. Major Friedrich Lang, operations officer for the 89th Infantry Division, concluded in his December report, "The forest negates some American advantages, their air power, their armor, but their artillery remains decisive. We cannot move without being targeted, cannot concentrate forces without being obliterated, cannot effectively counterattack because their supporting fires destroy our formations before they reach American positions. The terrain favors defense, but their artillery overcomes the terrain."
December 1944 brought Hitler's last gamble in the West, Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge. German commanders understood that success required neutralizing American artillery, if only temporarily. The offensive was planned for winter weather that would ground Allied aircraft and slow American mobility. Simultaneously, German forces would advance through the Ardennes at night, hoping to overrun American positions before coordinated artillery could respond. For 2 days, the plan worked. Surprise and weather gave German armor and infantry initial success, pushing deep into American lines and capturing thousands of prisoners. But as the advance slowed and American forces stabilized, the artillery balance reasserted itself with brutal finality. On December 19th, the weather cleared. Within hours, American artillery achieved what German planners had dreaded: complete aerial observation combined with unlimited ammunition and perfect fire coordination. General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, had access to corps-level artillery support. 17 battalions, 204 guns, coordinated through a single FDC. When German forces attempted to surround Bastogne, they moved into a kill zone covered by every American gun within 20 kilometers. Oberst Ludwig Meyer commanded a Kampfgruppe from the 2nd Panzer Division tasked with taking Bastogne from the west. His unit included 42 tanks, 30 armored vehicles, and 800 infantry. On December 22nd, Meyer's force advanced to within 3 kilometers of the American perimeter. At 14:35 hours, American forward observers identified Meyer's concentration. At 14:42, the TOT order was transmitted. At 14:47, 178 shells detonated simultaneously across Meyer's position. The barrage lasted 18 seconds and destroyed or damaged 31 vehicles, killing approximately 200 men. Meyer survived in his command tank and attempted to reorganize. 20 minutes later, a second TOT strike hit the same area with 156 shells. Meyer's Kampfgruppe ceased to exist as a coherent unit. Survivors retreated in disorder, abandoning equipment and wounded. The pattern repeated across the entire Bulge salient. German units that concentrated for attack were obliterated by TOT fire. Units that dispersed to avoid artillery lacked the mass to break American defenses. Every attempt to coordinate multi-battalion assaults was detected and crushed by artillery before units could close with American positions. General-Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division, sent increasingly desperate messages to Army Group B headquarters. December 23rd, cannot advance under this fire. Request artillery support. December 24th, our artillery destroyed by counter-battery fire. American artillery dominates battlefield. December 25th, division combat ineffective. Cannot continue effective operations. By December 26th, when Patton's Third Army reached Bastogne, the German offensive had failed. American casualties exceeded 19,000, but German losses approached 68,000, a 3.5-to-1 ratio that reflected artillery's decisive impact. American artillery had fired approximately 1.2 million shells during the Bulge fighting, compared to perhaps 180,000 German rounds. The Battle of the Bulge proved that German tactical skill and operational surprise could not overcome systematic American artillery superiority. Even when circumstances favored the Wehrmacht, surprise, favorable terrain, weather that grounded aircraft, American artillery coordination ultimately determined the battle's outcome.
By March 1945, the Allied advance reached Germany's final natural barrier, the Rhine River. German commanders understood that losing the Rhine meant losing the war. They also understood that American artillery would make defending the river nearly impossible. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in the West, had at his disposal the remnants of 60 divisions, perhaps 300,000 combat-effective troops. Against them, the Allies massed 85 divisions and 4,000 artillery pieces. The American plan for crossing the Rhine at Remagen and elsewhere relied on artillery preparation of unprecedented scale. General Courtney Hodges, commanding 1st Army, assembled 41 artillery battalions, 492 guns, to support the Remagen bridgehead alone. On March 7th, when American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact, German command faced catastrophe. Hitler ordered the bridge's destruction at any cost. German artillery, Nebelwerfers, and V-2 rockets targeted the structure repeatedly. American artillery responded with overwhelming force. Any German battery that fired at the bridge was identified within seconds by counter-battery radar and engaged by multiple American battalions. German gun crews faced a stark choice: fire and die immediately or remain silent and fail their mission. Hauptmann Ernst Schneider commanded an 88mm battery ordered to engage the bridge from position 6 kilometers away. His report, recovered after the war, details the futility. We unlimbered and prepared to fire at 17:20 hours. Our first round left the barrel at 17:24. At 17:26, American counter-battery fire arrived, and I counted 34 explosions simultaneously across our position. 3 guns destroyed, 11 men dead, the rest wounded or in shock. We did not fire a second round. The mathematics of survival had become impossible for German artillery. To engage targets meant certain destruction. To remain silent meant irrelevance. Either way, American forces advanced. At the Rhine's eastern bank, German infantry watched American engineers construct pontoon bridges under the cover of continuous artillery support. Any German attempt to interfere met instant, overwhelming response. Forward observers called in TOT missions on machine gun nests, mortar positions, any threat to the crossing. Lieutenant Hans Weber, defending the eastern approaches to Remagen, recorded the experience. We could see them building the bridges, see the trucks and tanks crossing, but we could do nothing. If we fired, if we even revealed our positions, the artillery came within minutes. Not scattered fire we might survive, but concentrated simultaneous barrages that obliterated entire platoons. We sat in our positions and watched them cross because doing anything else meant death. By March 24th, when the British launched Operation Plunder, the main Rhine assault in the north, American artillery doctrine had evolved beyond mere fire support. Artillery had become the dominant arm, with infantry and armor operating under its protective umbrella. The Plunder preliminary bombardment involved 3,500 Allied guns firing for 3 hours, an expenditure of approximately 50,000 tons of shells, more than the entire Luftwaffe dropped on Britain during the Blitz. German defensive positions ceased to exist before ground forces even began crossing. Oberst Heinrich Vogel, commanding the 180th Infantry Division's defense sector, survived the bombardment in a deep bunker. His report was terse. After the barrage, there was nothing left to command. Trenches collapsed, bunkers buried, communications severed, weapons destroyed or buried under debris. When British forces began crossing, we had perhaps 200 effective soldiers remaining from a division of 8,000. We could not resist. We could only surrender or die.
By April 1945, as Allied forces drove into Germany's heartland, the artillery war was essentially over. German guns fell silent for lack of ammunition, trained crews, and functioning command structures. American artillery roamed freely, supporting advances with fire that German forces could neither suppress nor evade. The statistical record tells the story with cold precision. From D-Day to V-Day, American artillery fired approximately 23.6 million rounds in the European theater. German artillery fired perhaps 4.3 million rounds across all Western Front operations in the same period. A 5.5 to 1 disparity that understates American advantage because their shells were more powerful, more accurate, and employed more effectively. The kill ratio favored American artillery overwhelmingly. German records, fragmentary as they are, suggest that American artillery caused approximately 40% of all German casualties in Northwest Europe, roughly 280,000 killed and wounded. German artillery caused perhaps 8% of American casualties, approximately 22,000. The disparity reflects not just numbers, but system effectiveness. Equally important was artillery's effect on German combat power. Units under constant American artillery pressure operated at 30 to 50% effectiveness, even when not actively engaged. The threat of instant, overwhelming fire prevented concentration, disrupted logistics, and paralyzed tactical initiative. German commanders found themselves unable to execute plans because movement drew fire, assembly drew fire, communication drew fire. Artillery had become a form of area denial, rendering entire zones of the battlefield unusable to German forces. The psychological dimension completed the equation. By war's end, German soldiers feared American artillery more than any other threat. Veteran NCOs who had survived years on the Eastern Front broke under weeks of Western Front artillery fire. The instant, unpredictable nature of TOT fire created trauma that traditional bombardment, however heavy, did not produce. General Lieutenant Hans Spadel, Chief of Staff for Army Group B, wrote in his post-war memoir, "American artillery represented a quantum leap in capability that we never matched or effectively countered. It was not simply that they had more guns or more shells, though they had both. It was that they had transformed artillery from a supporting arm into a decisive weapon system. They could find any target, mass any amount of fire, and deliver it with timing and precision that made defense impossible." The revolution in artillery warfare that America achieved between 1941 and 1945 had implications far beyond World War II. The principles, centralized fire direction, radio coordination, synchronized mass fires, became fundamental to modern artillery doctrine worldwide. In the decades following the war, armies studied American TOT techniques and adopted them as standard practice. The Fire Direction Center became universal. Radio coordination replaced telephone networks. Plotting boards and calculating devices evolved into digital computers that could manage fires from hundreds of guns simultaneously. The Wehrmacht's failure to adapt, by contrast, became a case study in institutional rigidity. German military excellence in tactics, leadership, and small unit performance could not compensate for systemic disadvantage in artillery coordination. The lesson was clear. Warfare had become too complex, too fast-paced for decentralized control to remain effective. Modern combat required integration, synchronization, and technological infrastructure that individual skill could not replicate. For the soldiers who fought under American artillery's protection or German artillery's ineffectiveness, the revolution was intensely personal. American infantrymen learned to trust that fire support would arrive instantly, accurately, overwhelmingly. German soldiers learned that no skill or courage could save them when American artillery opened fire. Sergeant Daniel McCarthy, forward observer with the 2nd Infantry Division, reflected years later. "We knew we had an advantage, but I don't think we fully understood how one-sided it was until after the war. We could call in fire missions that involved hundreds of guns, have the shells land exactly where we wanted them, exactly when we wanted them. The Germans couldn't do anything remotely similar. It wasn't a fair fight, but war isn't about fairness. It's about winning, and our artillery ensured we won." Oberst Müller, the Wehrmacht artillery inspector who had dismissed early reports of American capabilities, wrote bitterly in 1946, "We lost the artillery war in 1942 when the Americans began developing coordinated fire systems and we dismissed it as impossible or impractical. By 1944, when we finally understood what they had achieved, we lacked the time, resources, and industrial capacity to respond. We fought the rest of the war with obsolete methods against an enemy who had redefined artillery warfare. The outcome was inevitable from that point forward." The story of American artillery in World War II is ultimately about innovation overcoming tradition, systems thinking defeating individual excellence, and industrial capacity enabling tactical revolution. The Wehrmacht couldn't comprehend how Americans fired thousands of shells in an instant because they were asking the wrong question. The answer wasn't in the shells or the guns.
It was in the radios, the mathematics, the coordination, and the industrial base that made synchronized mass fires routine rather than miraculous. That comprehension came too late to matter, and the cost was measured in shattered German formations across France, Belgium, and Germany itself. Positions obliterated before defenders could react, offensives crushed before they could develop, and a defensive strategy rendered obsolete by weapons that struck with the speed of thought and the power of thunder. The fields of Mortain, the forests of Hurtgen, the snows of the Ardennes, and the banks of the Rhine all told the same story. American artillery had changed warfare, and the Wehrmacht never found an answer.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.